Hey guys, welcome back. So tonight we're going to wander into the world of gladiators. Not the Russell Crowe kind who somehow had perfect hair in the middle of a sandpit full of tigers, but the real ones. The less glamorous, more tragic, and sometimes surprisingly bureaucratic gladiators of ancient Rome. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've probably seen 100 documentaries where they charge at each other with tridents and swords. And the narrator gets really dramatic about life and death in the Colosseum. That's not what we're doing tonight. We're here for something much quieter, much slower. We're not here to watch the fight. We're here to sit around afterward, maybe share a glass of cheap Roman wine, and ask the ultimate bedtime history question. What happened when the fighting was over? What did gladiators actually do once they survived long enough to hang up the sword and walk away? Did they retire to a nice villa with a pension plan? Did they just keep fighting until someone chopped them in half? Or did Rome actually have a weird system for dealing with these men who had basically become blood-soaked celebrities? Well, the answer, like most things in Roman history, is kind of all of the above. Let's ease into this. Gladiators weren't all the same, and neither were their retirements. Some were slaves. Some were free men who signed up willingly, because apparently ancient Rome didn't have enough extreme sports. And some were criminals who got forced into the arena as punishment, which means the ending of their careers depended a lot on how they started. If you were a slave gladiator and you somehow survived years of fights without being skewered like a kebab, you might earn something called a Rudis. That's a little wooden sword. Doesn't sound like much, but in Rome, that sword was basically your gold watch, your retirement bonus, and your freedom papers all in one. It meant you were done. No more fighting. You could walk out technically a free man. Of course, walking out was easier said than done, because here's the thing. Once you'd been a gladiator, you weren't just a person anymore. You were kind of a living spectacle, a human version of a Netflix show people couldn't stop watching. So even if you retired, everyone knew who you were. And Rome being Rome, they weren't exactly big on letting famous people quietly fade into obscurity. Now, some gladiators actually leaned into that fame. They became trainers working in the gladiator schools, basically ancient gyms, except instead of sweaty people on treadmills, you had sweaty people swinging swords at each other. These retired fighters would teach the next generation how to not die too quickly in the arena. Kind of like the way old boxers sometimes open gyms today. Others went into bodyguard work. Imagine hiring a guy who used to fight lions in front of 50,000 people to stand outside your house at night. Yeah, not a bad deterrent. No burglar is going to argue with a man who literally wrestled a tiger for fun. And then there were the celebrity endorsements. No, really. Some retired gladiators would lend their names and faces to advertisements. Think of ancient Roman graffiti, with some poor guy scratching "Come buy olive oil," endorsed by Marcus the Murmillo on a wall. Because apparently, if you survived enough sword fights, you could sell a lot of cooking supplies. But let's slow down a bit, because retirement wasn't always that glamorous. A lot of gladiators didn't actually want to quit. Some of them loved the fame. Imagine being a nobody, a slave or a criminal, and suddenly thousands of people are screaming your name in the Colosseum. That's a hard drug to quit. So some retired gladiators actually came back. Even after they got their freedom, they voluntarily signed up again. The Romans had a word for these guys: octorati. Basically, people who said, yes, I know I could live a peaceful life now, but instead, I'd like to go back to being stabbed at for entertainment. Which honestly makes modern UFC fighters look like amateurs. Of course, society didn't exactly respect that choice. In Roman culture, being a gladiator was kind of shameful. Sure, the crowds loved you when you were fighting, but outside the arena, you were still considered a lowlife. A retired gladiator wasn't invited to the fancy dinner parties with senators. You weren't exactly marrying into the imperial family. You were stuck in this weird limbo, famous, but not respectable. Think of it like being a reality TV star. Everyone knows your name, but no one really wants you at their daughter's wedding. Let's float over to another possibility: the quiet, sad retirement. Some gladiators did get their Rudis, walked away, and tried to live a normal life. But normal is relative. Remember, most of these men had been trained killers since their teenage years. They didn't have career counseling. Nobody was teaching them accounting or pottery. So unless they had saved money from their fights, and yes, gladiators could actually get paid pretty well if they were popular, they usually ended up broke. There are Roman tombstones that show us little glimpses of this. Inscriptions that say things like, "Here lies Flamma, who fought 34 times and lived to see freedom." It's both impressive and kind of depressing. The man's entire identity was his number of fights. No mention of a wife, no kids, no hobbies. Just fought a lot, didn't die. And then, of course, there were the ones who didn't make it very long after retiring. Being a gladiator was brutal on the body. Even if you survived, you carried scars, broken bones, missing fingers, half-healed wounds. Retirement might have lasted a year or two, maybe 5 if you were lucky, but most didn't exactly make it to a cozy old age. Rome didn't have great health care, unless you count herbs and prayers as health care. So when you think about it, retirement for a gladiator wasn't really about living happily ever after. It was about surviving long enough to briefly enjoy freedom before either running out of money, getting pulled back into the arena, or slowly falling apart physically. But here's the twist. Despite all that misery, gladiators fascinated Roman society. Retired or not, they had this weird allure. Roman women, especially, were said to swoon over gladiators. Writers at the time complain about it constantly. They called it the gladiator effect. Apparently, nothing was sexier than a man with scars and a reputation for stabbing people in the sand. Which makes sense because Roman society was nothing if not consistent about being weirdly bloodthirsty. So some retired gladiators leaned into that. They became lovers or kept men of wealthy women. Others, less romantically, were rented out for, well, let's just say, entertainment purposes. Yes, Rome absolutely had that kind of market. And yes, it was considered scandalous, but also nobody stopped it.